I could go back and play with these and change their look, make them sepia tone. I could do endless variations as long as I have these things separated out correctly and organized. So you can see those subtle full spectrum bands running across the top. It's a little too much, so I'm going to take it down. Or I can use, instead of like soft light, I can just do normal, right? But I can make it dissolve and then take its opacity down if you want that kind of filtered messiness to it. Dissolve isn't something I like to use a lot of because it just breaks into individual pixels, right? But if you're at high enough resolution with the vector floating above it, it can be kind of an interesting effect. But I'm going to do soft light, I think, and I'm going to do very subtle, just to give it a little something. So there's just a little bit of green in that blue, and there's just a little bit of purple in some of the others. All right, now we're going to deal with not just regular color holds like this, which are kind of fancy, but we're going to deal with playing with our outlines themselves. And what we can do, because it's a vector outline, we just have to unlock it. We're going to keep it as a vector, keep it as a smart layer. And if you're really worried, you can duplicate it, right? And keep one safe. But we're going to play with color holds. So what I'm going to do is double click it. So I already have a color hold selected there, or a special effect. Double click on your layer until you see your layer style options. The most basic layer style option you can play with is coloring your black line work with what's called a color overlay. So instead of it being filled in with black, what if we filled it in with a different color? And I have to turn the effects on, so I turn them off. All right, so let's play with these. So that's with red. That doesn't quite work. So let's find a good color. Well, I can steal that from the different illustrations I've chosen. I can steal it from my swatches, or even from my own artwork. Right. Now, usually solid black is not the best choice. But you probably want something, if you like the way it looked with black, you'll probably want something that's pretty dark. So I might go with a really dark green. Okay, also I have this layer style on, which is the outer glow, which is pretty darn strong. So let me turn that off for now. Often, if you want kind of warmth, you can go with a deeper kind of brown. For your color overlay, right? And that can look nice. Kind of highlights the blue. And you don't have to keep it at 100% opacity, so you can let the black kind of show through it a little bit. The other thing you can play with is you can even put a gradient on your line work, so bringing kind of full spectrum to your lines. And you can see that there. So as long as it doesn't make it really muddy, you can play with different gradients. I'll use this kind of coppery one. Go to layer styles, gradient overlay. I can try different blending effects. But because the black's under it, it's not going to do too much unless I make it lighten. And then, of course, that's all underneath your color overlay. So if I turn my color overlay off, I get that kind of copper gradient overlay. And then I can combine the two. So that's a pretty big difference. So that's That's the most common type of color hold, is just changing the outline color to something else. Other layer style kind of special effects we can do. Here, let me just adjust the gradient overlay opacity. It's a little strong. Make that more subtle. And then the color overlay, let me darken that a little bit. Okay. So what else can we do? Well, we can make a drop shadow around the line work. This is subtle, but it could be really effective. It like adds duotone for you, but it matches it to your line work. And you decide how much, how dark, how spread out, how noisy, if you want to give it a little bit of that texture. I think I do want a little bit of that texture here. If I want more distance, I can do that. But that doesn't make sense because it doesn't line up. Right. So I can try more size instead. That's looking nicer. Kind of activates these empty areas. But it also muddies the whites of my design a little bit, which is where these color holds over the top could help. So instead of multiply, maybe I want to color burn or linear burn, all these ways of making it a little bit darker, or just overlay or soft light or pin light. Yeah, pin light seems to work pretty well. Okay. And you, of course, play with the opacity. So outer glow was something I played with early on. I'm going to dial that way back, but I still like a little bit. It's the opposite. So drop shadow can give you kind of a duotone shadow on one side. Outer glow will give you a duotone highlight on the other side. So you see that glow. That can help bring out the design. And again, you decide how much to spread that out. You can make it noisy. Which in the case of having so many kind of flat, even colors might be nice. And it helps offset on darker backgrounds. You can put a stroke on everything. You know, if you just want solid, clean division. And that looks kind of cool. It brings white back to everything. I'm using a white outside stroke, but maybe I thin it down, make it more subtle. And I can change its color. So maybe I do kind of a cream color instead of the bright white. So all these things are great tools. Of course, they can all be overdone. But I'm just showing you all these options. And then you have bevel and emboss. This will do it to all of your outlines, right? Just like we were doing it to our logos. I can give it a texture. I can play with how strong that texture is, how subtle it is. I'll break it up a little bit, play with the depth of it. And now because I have these drop shadows and everything, and I've got the bevel and emboss, maybe I don't need the color overlay to be quite so strong. Maybe I don't need the gradient overlay to be quite so strong. And you kind of pick your battles. What do you think's working best for you? You can even fill the whole thing with a pattern if you want. This is something I don't usually use. Let's keep it simple here. So you can fill your outline with a given pattern. You can barely see it. It's like a thin little dash mark. But it varies it even more, which can be interesting. Kind of looks like stitching. All right, and of course, all those color hold effects can just be turned off too, but then they can individually be adjusted. And you can decide how helpful they are. I don't know if the gradient overlay is actually helpful. But I do kind of like that pattern overlay. Where that ended up. Okay, so then you want to check it on the different backgrounds. So that's on a black shirt. And now because of those layer styles, I have an offset that will show where my edges end, even on a dark shirt. On middle gray, it shows up well, maybe a little faded. And on white, yep, it shows up well. So when you're happy with all of those, you have a finished spot illustration. There's only one other thing I think I can do to kind of make this something I enjoy. And we've done texture overlays before. This time I want to do a vector texture overlay. So I want to look for a grunge EPS texture. And I have to visit the page to actually get it. There are a lot of these online because you have to download the EPS, and sometimes you have to pay for it. But these are free, so that's good. How do I get it? Let's see. So this will give me a pack of vectors as a zip file. And these are, free to use. You can see the vectors here. They're not clean. They're vector files of different distressed kind of textures that you can overlay on top of logos, on top of t-shirt designs, or on top of illustrations. But unlike a raster file, where it matters what the resolution is of your texture overlay, having a vector texture overlay will scale with whatever size you make for your illustration. So they're kind of amazing that way. So it's a little long to download, so I'm going to pause it. Okay, now I have downloaded the zip files. I'm going to unzip them. And often the problem is they just give us so many. It's an embarrassment of riches. But I'm going to drag them in. Remember, if you drag and drop your EPS files, oh yeah, this one looks like a good one. They'll come in as smart layers. And even though they're a vector, I can stretch them to fit over my image, like so. I'm going to have it on top of everything except the color holds, right? But if I wanted to, I can move it down below my line work.